Audrey Esarey, and today I'm going to teach you how to sew a curved seam using my pattern, the Circle Study. This quilt, the Circle Study, has 9 blocks in it, and each block only has 5 seams. Here's a sample block that's a little bit smaller than the ones that I've used in the quilt. The pattern has 3 block sizes, 8-inch, 12-inch, and 16-inch. You can tell that each block has a curved seam here that is a very gentle curve, and a curved seam here that is a half circle curve. The last seam is this straight seam right here. What I'd like to demonstrate today is sewing this gentle curve and this half circle. This is the finished block of what we're looking to do, and so we're just gonna keep that out. But these are the pieces that we're gonna start with. So I cut my fabric pieces from my paper templates, and you can see my paper templates have 3 registration marks. I have transferred each of the registration marks to the fabric using a marking tool. Some marking tools disappear with the iron, and sometimes I just will use a pencil. It's important just to make a very small mark because that is within your seam allowance, and you don't want your mark to extend outside onto the quilt when it's finished. So I always make a very small mark within the seam allowance when I'm transitioning the registration marks to my fabric templates. This is also a paper template. I've done the same thing for my template B piece, and you can see that I've transferred the registration marks. The first thing that I want to do is pin these 2 pieces together. So I'm going to flip this over, and I'm going to pin at the corners first. If you're working with solid fabrics, you have a right, and if you're working with solid fabrics, you'll have both sides of the fabric that are the same. But if you're working with a print, your fabric will have a right and a wrong side, so you'll want to make sure to place the right sides together. You can see that some of these edges are a little bit wavy, and that's just fine because this fabric curve is cut on the bias of the fabric, which means it's cut on the stretchy side. It's okay to manipulate the fabric a little bit just to get everything to blend together. But if you find yourself forcing the fabric, that means that one of your pieces is probably not cut properly. Now that I have my 2 templates pinned together, I'm going to go to my sewing machine. I'm sewing with a 1/4-inch foot that I backstitch at the start and the end. I piece with a 50 weight cotton quilting thread. Notice that I'm pausing to take out my pins as I'm sewing. If you find that your fabric starts to bunch up at all, or that it looks like it's not going to sew evenly or give you a pucker, it's okay to pause and lift the presser foot a little bit and adjust the fabric underneath your presser foot. Remember that I'm backstitching at the start and the end of each one of my seams. When I sew curves, I prefer to press my seams open. I'm just going to open that seam with my fingers and carefully have the iron go right in the middle of the seam. And then I'm going to turn my fabric over and press that from the top as well. I love using a wool pressing mat because the seams kind of sink into the pressing mat, and then you don't end up having a shadow of your seam on the top of the fabric. Now that I have this half circle pieced, I'm ready to attach this to my background. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to pin at each corner, and then I'm going to pin the center. Once again, if you're working with solid fabrics, your fabric does not have a right or wrong side, but if you're working with a print, it will. So you just want to make sure that your right side's together if you're working with a print. I like to use sharp glass head pins because if there's any heat at all, or if I get the head of the pin around my iron, then it won't melt. All right, you can see at first it didn't look like that was gonna pin together, but pinned together just fine. Now I'm gonna take this to my machine. And remember, I'm gonna backstitch at the start and the end. Just gonna manipulate that curve a little as I'm sewing, taking the pins out as I go. It's okay if you get a little variation on your seams. They're not absolutely perfectly lined up, but that is okay. As I come to the end, I'm going to backstitch and cut my thread. You can see here, I've got my half circle set into the background. And I'm going to come to the iron and do the same thing. Just kind of hold this open and press around. You can see that it presses open really easily. Press from the top. And you can see that we have created half of our block. There are a lot of design opportunities that you have with this pattern, looking at the circles. It's a good opportunity to play with color, so you can audition different pattern pieces over the tops of the color and really significantly change the look of the quilt based on how you want the quilt to look. There's also, since it's a square block, no correct orientation of the block. It can be placed facing this way, or you can turn the block. And another thing you can do is introduce the background fabric into the quilt to give a completely different look. So that's why I like this pattern as an example of curved piecing, because you have a gentle curve and a half circle. And it's also a good opportunity to play with a lot of color out of your stash. So I hope this pattern inspires you to sew curves.